The afternoon sun cast long shadows over a quiet roadside diner in rural Alabama. A group of bikers, clad in leather jackets and roaring with laughter, had gathered in the parking lot, their motorcycles lined up like steel beasts ready to pounce. Among them was Jake, a burly man with a reputation for being tough and fearless. Inside the diner, an elderly black man sat alone at the counter, sipping his coffee in silence. His weathered hands and calm demeanor suggested a life full of stories, but he kept to himself. When he finally stepped outside, heading toward his old pickup truck, Jake and his crew took notice. "Hey, old man," Jake sneered, stepping forward. "You lost or something?" The man paused, meeting Jake's gaze with steady eyes. He said nothing, but what happened next would change everything. The black man stood still, his face unreadable, as Jake and his biker gang circled around him. The air was thick with tension, and a few diners inside the restaurant pressed their faces against the window, sensing trouble brewing outside. Jake took another step forward, towering over the older man. "What, cat got your tongue?" he taunted, his voice laced with arrogance. His crew chuckled, enjoying the show. The man sighed, setting his coffee cup on the hood of his truck. His movements were slow, deliberate, and unbothered, as if he had seen men like Jake before many times. "You don't belong here, old-timer," another biker chimed in, crossing his arms. "Why don't you take that rust bucket and drive back to wherever you came from?" The man tilted his head slightly, finally speaking. His voice was calm, steady. "I came from a place you wouldn't last a day in, boy." Jake frowned, the confidence in his eyes flickering for just a second. "That so? And where would that be?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he unzipped his faded bomber jacket, revealing a worn but unmistakable patch, United States Marine Corps. Underneath it, the words Vietnam veteran were stitched in bold letters. The laughter stopped. A few of the bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Even Jake's smirk faltered as he stared at the patch. His jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. The man leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of something dangerous. "You ever been in a real fight, son?" Jake clenched his fists, his bravado cracking. The gang was waiting to see his next move. And then, Jake's fists tightened at his sides, his pride warring with the sudden unease creeping up his spine. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, the once playful jeers now replaced with uncertain silence. The old man didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone held a weight that pressed down on everyone around him. He had been in battles where lives were measured in split seconds, where fear wasn't an option, where men like Jake wouldn't have lasted a day. "You don't look so tough to me," Jake finally spat, trying to regain control of the moment. "Bet you ain't as dangerous as you think." The man exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Son, you don't want to test that theory." But Jake wasn't the type to back down, not in front of his crew. He stepped closer, raising a hand as if to shove the veteran's shoulder. The moment his fingers barely grazed the man's jacket, everything changed. In a blur of movement too fast for the eye to catch, the veteran shifted his weight, his hand snapping up like a striking cobra. Before Jake even realized what was happening, his wrist was seized in an iron grip, his entire body spun, and in the next breath, he was on his knees, his arm twisted behind his back in a brutal hold. Jake gasped, his breath coming out in ragged pants. The pain was sharp, precise. Not enough to break anything, but enough to send a clear message. I could end this right now. The other bikers froze. No one dared to step in. They had never seen Jake taken down so effortlessly. The veteran leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. The only reason you're still in one piece is because I don't see the point in breaking you. His grip tightened slightly, sending a fresh wave of pain through Jake's shoulder. But if you ever put your hands on me, or anyone else like this again, you won't be walking away. Jake swallowed hard. For the first time in a long time, fear flickered in his eyes. The veteran released him, and Jake stumbled backward, breathing heavily. His face burned with humiliation, but something else lingered in his gaze. Respect, or maybe just the realization that he had picked the wrong man to mess with. The old man dusted off his jacket, picked up his coffee cup from the truck's hood, and took a slow sip as if nothing had happened. Then he turned, opened his truck door, and climbed inside. The engine rumbled to life. And as he pulled away from the diner, the gang of bikers remained rooted in place, watching him go, silent, thoughtful, and changed. But for Jake, this wasn't over. Not yet. 3 days later, Jake stood in front of a small house on the outskirts of town. The wooden fence was worn, the porch simple, and parked beside it was a familiar old truck. The old man sat on the porch steps, a lazy dog resting at his feet. He didn't look surprised to see Jake. "Knew you'd come," he said, not looking up from the cup of tea in his hands. Jake clenched his fists, but this time, there was no arrogance in his stance. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. The old man set his cup down and met Jake's gaze. "Name's Samuel Carter," he said. "Former Marine Corps sergeant. Fought in Vietnam, survived things you couldn't imagine. And now," he shrugged, "just an old man who enjoys his peace." Jake remained silent. He had done his research. No one in town knew much about Samuel Carter, but military records told a different story. His name was attached to medals and commendations. Soldiers who had served alongside him spoke of him with reverence. He wasn't just a veteran, he was a legend. "So what?" Jake finally said, trying to mask his unease. "You want to teach me a lesson?" Samuel let out a quiet chuckle. "No, son. I just want to know why you're really here." Jake opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. He wasn't sure himself. His whole life had been about strength. Growing up in a rough environment, he had learned early on that respect was earned with fists. He fought to survive, to be recognized, to be feared. But for the first time, he had met a man he couldn't intimidate. Someone who didn't just overpower him but seemed to understand him. And strangely, he didn't hate it. Samuel studied him, as if reading the thoughts swirling in his head. "You don't have to keep going down this road, Jake," he said, his voice steady but kind. Jake frowned. "What road?" "Fighting ghosts," Samuel replied. "I've seen men like you before, always looking for something to prove. But what are you really running from?" Jake felt something tighten in his chest. The words struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He looked at the old man, wanting to argue, wanting to deny it. But instead, he just stood there, silent. Samuel smiled slightly. "You can stay," he said. "Have a cup of tea. Or you can walk away and keep doing what you've always done. The choice is yours." Jake glanced at the house, then down at his hands. Hands that had only ever known violence. But right now, for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do with them. He had never had tea before. But maybe, just maybe, he'd give it a try. Jake hesitated for a moment longer, then exhaled sharply. "Fine," he muttered, stepping onto the porch. The wooden planks creaked beneath his boots as he lowered himself onto the step beside Samuel. Samuel poured another cup of tea from a simple ceramic pot and handed it to Jake. He took it, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. It smelled earthy, unfamiliar. Jake stared into the cup as if it held answers. "Never had tea before," he admitted. Samuel chuckled. "There's a first time for everything." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the rustling trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was peaceful, unsettlingly so. Jake wasn't used to this kind of quiet. It wasn't the tense stillness before a fight, nor the exhaustion that followed one. It was something else entirely. "You've been looking for a fight your whole life, haven't you?" Samuel finally asked, breaking the silence. Jake frowned, fingers tightening around the cup. "That what you think?" Samuel took a slow sip of his tea. "I know the type. Grew up scrapping to survive. Got good at it. Figured that made you strong." He glanced at Jake. "And maybe it did. But strength without control? That's just another kind of weakness." Jake scoffed. "You don't know a damn thing about me." Samuel shrugged. "Maybe. But I know this, you wouldn't be here if you weren't looking for something. Question is, do you know what it is?" Jake opened his mouth to snap back, but the words caught in his throat. What was he looking for? Revenge? Validation? Or was it something else? He had spent years trying to prove himself. But to who? His gang? His old man, who had always told him he'd never amount to anything. Himself? He swallowed hard, staring out at the horizon. "What happened to you?" he asked instead. "After the war." Samuel was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "Came back home, but the war didn't stay behind." His fingers absently traced the rim of his cup. "Lost friends over there. Lost more when I got back. Anger kept me alive, but it also kept me alone. Took me years to realize that surviving ain't the same as living." Jake listened, feeling something stir in his chest. Samuel turned to him. "So tell me, Jake, are you surviving or are you living?" Jake didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find one. Jake sat in silence, Samuel's words weighing heavy on his chest. Surviving or living? He had never thought about it like that before. His whole life had been about pushing forward, proving himself through fists and dominance. But sitting here, sipping tea with a man who had seen more battles than he could imagine, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he even knew who he was outside of the fights, the gang, the reputation. Jake set the cup down, exhaling. "And what if surviving is all I know?" Samuel nodded, as if he understood that feeling all too well. "Then you learn," he said simply. "Same way you learn to fight. Only this time you're fighting for something worth it." Jake shook his head. "I wouldn't even know where to start." Samuel studied him for a moment, then stood up, stretching. "Well, I can't tell you how to live your life. But I can tell you this, whatever you're running from, it's gonna catch up to you sooner or later. And when it does, you'll have to make a choice. Jake scoffed, but deep down, he knew Samuel was right. Just then, the distant growl of motorcycles shattered the quiet. Jake's body tensed. He knew that sound. His gang. Samuel didn't flinch, but his eyes flickered toward Jake. You expecting company? Jake's jaw clenched. He had left without a word, and he should have known they wouldn't just let it slide. The bikes rolled to a stop at the edge of the property. A half-dozen men dismounted, led by Travis, Jake's second in command. His face twisted into a smirk as he took in the sight of Jake sitting on the porch with an old man. Well, Travis drawled. Thought maybe you'd gone soft on us, Jake. Didn't figure you for the tea-drinking type. The others chuckled, but there was an edge to their laughter. They weren't just here to joke. Jake stood up slowly, hands at his sides. What do you want, Travis? Travis took a step forward, resting a hand on his belt where a knife glinted in the fading sunlight. You walked away, brother. That ain't how it works. You owe us. Jake knew exactly what that meant. There was no leaving without consequences. He had been on the other side of this confrontation before, hunting down men who thought they could break free. He looked at Samuel, who remained calm, watching but not interfering. This was his fight. For the first time in his life, Jake felt like he had a choice. He could go back, slip into the life he had always known, keep running in circles, never really escaping. Or he could stand his ground. He took a deep breath, then turned back to Travis. I don't owe you a damn thing. Silence. Travis' smirk vanished. That's so? He murmured. Guess we'll have to remind you how things work. He lunged. But Jake was ready. This time he wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting to leave. The brawl was fast, brutal. Jake moved differently now. Not reckless, not wild, but controlled. Every hit landed with precision, every move deliberate. Within moments, 2 men were down, groaning in the dirt. Travis staggered back, wiping blood from his mouth. His eyes flickered with something close to fear. You're making a mistake, he spat. Jake stepped forward, his voice steady. No, I finally got something to fight for. Travis hesitated, then cursed under his breath. He knew Jake wasn't coming back. One by one, the bikers climbed back onto their motorcycles. The engines roared to life, and then, just like that, they were gone. Jake exhaled, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. He turned to Samuel, who simply nodded in approval. Not bad, the old man said. Jake let out a breathless chuckle. Not bad for a guy who used to solve all his problems with his fists, huh? Samuel smirked. The difference is, this time you fought for yourself. Jake looked out at the horizon, where the last traces of his old life had disappeared down the road. For the first time, he felt free. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally living.